Let me introduce Steve Lansing. Some of you might have already encountered him. He is on the external faculty here at the Hub. He is also a colleague of Stefan and myself at the Santa Fe Institute, and then he hangs out a lot in Southeast Asia. Never quite know where. So, you know, on one island and the other where they discover very interesting things. And so based on that, we will get some insights from the tropics, which is sort of, here we had pictures from the Baltic and sort of rather sparse environments. And now we go into the opposite environment, namely the tropics. Okay, we are up. Why the tropics matter. Steve.
Thank you very much, Manfred, and thank you, Manfred and Stefan and everybody for being here. I was, just listening. I entertained the idea that we're at the start of something new, because a lot of work has been done in sustainability, lots been done in complexity, but actually applying complexity to sustainability hasn't really happened much. I mean, it's there. We've got. Let me put it like this: there's been a tremendous improvement in our understanding of coupled systems. You just heard Maya. She's one of the people who's made that happen. But what we haven't done is sort of coarse grain the whole problem and say, well, you know, what are the curves that need to bend? How coarse grained can we get in understanding the problem of sustainability? So I'm going to give you an oversimplified story in about 12 minutes, right? Because I think we're way over time. So here we go. This is, and I'm sorry, I hope you can see some of this. The projector is fading on us, but my story is why the tropics matter. Well, they matter for the biological world because they contain most of the terrestrial biodiversity and most of the marine biodiversity. They survived the Pleistocene, you know, in the next slide, I think. During the Ice Age, most of the planet was not very hospitable to life, buried under ice 12,000 years ago. I think down there you can see, I think that little white patch includes Austria, right? So planet survived, life survived, because these were the refuge for biodiversity, and everything came back really fast, right? The Holocene was a wonderful time to be a living thing, okay? But now we're in the stage where the tropics are also vital to us as a species, and we're changing them very, very fast, and that's where I work. So 2014, the G20 nations agreed to invest trillions and trillions of dollars in new infrastructure projects like dams and roads, and that all sounds great, like 25 million kilometers more roads, but 90% of them are in the tropics. And if you build roads, so that's also home to 2/3 of the world's poorest people, and by 2050, 60% of the world's children. It's vital to us. And the problem with building roads in the tropics is that habitat fragmentation by building roads is the most important cause of loss of diversity. It destroys biodiversity. Very simple, clear relationship. So on the one hand, we don't want to stop economic development, but on the other hand, if we keep at that rate, then we will destroy biodiversity in the tropics with unknown consequences. We're already now performing that experiment in the Amazon. I was just in Borneo a couple months ago with hunters and gatherers, the last hunter-gatherers that still hunt and gather in Borneo. And another talk I can't give you now is their plea. I'm supposed to come back and report that if we can't stop the intrusion of oil palms, their forest will completely disappear and their children will starve. So could we kindly get with it and do something about this stuff? Okay, so this is Bill Lawrence. If you haven't read him, he's great. He's an ecologist. With respect to the infrastructure tsunami, he says, all these infrastructure projects, which are well-intentioned, but the consequences could be catastrophic. So I'll just leave that point at that. Move on to my story, which is going to be about rice, which is the staple grain crop in the tropics, and in fact, it's the most important food for us humans. The problem is that flooded rice paddies emit lots of greenhouse gases. In fact, they emit, I think I've meant to look this up, it's like 2% greenhouse gas emissions due to rice paddies. So highest greenhouse gas emission from the major food crops. Okay, maybe if we can fix the cars, we can reduce those emissions, the CO2, but we're gonna need rice, right? And that is a very large source of greenhouse gas emissions. So can we do something about it? So here we are looking at the beautiful rice terraces of Bali, but unfortunately, each little rice plant is a little, cylinder that's emitting nitrous oxide and methane into the atmosphere. Okay, so can we fix it, all right? In Bali, for 1,000 years, communities have organized rice production by managing the flow of water. And they're little bitty things, 80 farmers, 40 hectares on average. They control pests in their fields by flooding. So in other words, after harvest, you flood a large area, and if it's a large enough area, then all the things that the rats and the mice and the insects that might destroy your next crop have nowhere to eat or live. Habitat is removed. That takes care of the pests. The problem is this huge area, right, gets flooded. And when it's flooded, then methane is emitted when the rice paddies are flooded, okay? So, let's see if I get the rest paid, yeah. Our question was, can you change the timing of irrigation and have an effect? This has already been tried in various ways. The rice paddies only emit methane when they're covered with water. It becomes anaerobic. The methanogenic bacteria get busy producing methane, and the rice stalks, as the rice gets larger, I should give you that picture again, then the gas can be emitted into the atmosphere. So don't flood the paddy, and that problem solved. Nitrous oxide is an even more potent greenhouse gas, but our solution is if you use up the nitrogen quickly, then there's nothing for it to get volatilized. Okay, so could we actually measure the consequences of changing the irrigation schedule just to fine-tune it to minimize the greenhouse gas emissions? So I lugged this expensive greenhouse gas gadget to Bali, and we've now done this experiment twice. We compare flooded paddies and the ones that get just, most of the time the water is just a centimeter or two below the surface of the soil, which is sufficient to pretty much put a stop to the methanogenic emissions. Okay, so look what happens. Here's the flux over time, over the weeks, from the flooded and the non-flooded paddies. The methane emissions are enormous in the paddies, but they're not in the ones that are following our simple little regime. Okay, and then to our surprise, not only do you reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, but the harvest yield almost doubles. We don't understand why that happened. I can talk about that more, but we're about to find out. Harvest yield almost doubled because we were thinking, how are we going to persuade the farmers? How much are the Danes going to have to pay, or the Norwegians, the farmers, to get them to change? And the answer is actually is not a problem. It's just mysterious. Anyway, I would like you now to listen to what the methane emissions from a single rice plant in that chamber sound like. Isn't that lovely? That's one rice plant, okay? Now, if we played the emissions from down there, you'd hardly hear it, right? So just think in terms of explaining. Imagine now all the rice plants on the planet, emitting. I mean, we should attach these to like your cars or everything. You could just sonify. There's a word for this, sonifying. Instead of just showing graphs, just let you hear what's going on. And anyway, so that's what we're doing now. And we'll play it for the farmers too, and I have hope. So there, I don't know how well you can see that, but that's the experimental apparatus. It's not very complicated. You're just, measuring the gases in the fields on either side of the Picaro machine. Okay, the greenhouse gases are reduced. The grain yields are nearly double. We don't know why. If anybody cares, I can tell you what we think might be happening. The question now is, can this solution be scaled up? Excuse me. So here we are in Bali, looking at rice paddies. You can't see them very well, but the colored patches that aren't brown are rice paddies, and they're different colored because they're planted at different times. And so what the satellite sees is different reflectances from a flooded field or a field with some rice or a field with a lot of rice, okay? So you get this kind of a patchwork mosaic. And so you can color it to see, like the blue and the red, those are different sized patches of growing rice, okay? So that's what it looks like. Question, why this pattern? Why that pattern? Is it just a random pattern? Or is there more to it? So here's one subak, that's one like village-sized irrigation system. Is it an independent unit, or is it part of a larger system? Balinese will tell you, well, it is kind of part of a larger system because we organize things through water temples, and I've written books about how that all works. But basically, they coordinate in their own way. In the name of the gods. Okay, so we can build a very simple model of this to discover how well a simple model can capture the dynamics that might explain that mosaic. The question is, why do we see the mosaic that I showed you? So here's a square. Here's a little lattice. Each little dot is a subak, and it's deciding what to plant for the year. So the colors are different irrigation schedules. Blue might mean plant rice in January and in August, and each of those is an annual schedule of irrigation. So everybody gets the rice irrigation schedule. There we go. And then at the end of a year, everybody calculates how much rice they've grown. And we debit the harvest based upon whether they had a water shortage or if the pests ate their rice. Okay, so there we go. And here's green is the one in the middle. Comparing with their neighbors, they see that the red one down to the south, the red irrigation schedule did better, so we copy red. So choose red. Everybody does that. That's the simplest possible model we could think of for the decision-making process, okay? So the colors, here we go. Here's the start. At first, they're random, and then there will be many pests because the pests can move from one field to the next. It hasn't been flooded over a large area. But then as the system evolves and groups form because they're able to control irrigation over a large enough area to bring the pest levels down, then you get patches like that, okay? So there's another mosaic pattern. And that means there are fewer pests because they have to go further to get their next rice snack, okay? But then it changes in an interesting way. Now the mosaic evolves. You know, it keeps evolving as long as anybody can do any better. So it just keeps continuing to compare options until it turns into something like that. And at that point, none of those dots can do better by choosing a different color, by choosing a different irrigation schedule. But that's weird, right? It doesn't really look like anything unless you're a physicist and you think, I've seen that. It's an Ising model. It's one of the most famous models in physics. What's happened here is it's gone through a critical transition from many small patches that are doing things to one large patch, which is controlling the dynamics. And at that point, if it's an Ising model, then it becomes magnetic. And if it's this model, it becomes Pareto optimal, meaning nobody can do any better by changing their irrigation schedule. Right? Harvest yields have optimized. Okay, well that wasn't hard to do. And here it goes. You go from random to lots of patches to one system. That transition from many small units to one large system is a phase transition, which we don't have time to talk about, but if you look it up, if you haven't already studied this, here we have it in Ising model. That's how magnetism works. Okay, it passes through a phase transition in a magnet from many little local spins to one coordinated system. You can go up or down. As the temperature drops, things become more magnetic. They align into patches. They become connected. Here's a comparison of the magnet and the farms. Remember how simple this was. Our little model was a really very, very simple lattice model. The transition occurs from little clumps to one big system at the same point. In magnetism, it's reversible. In other words, you raise or lower the temperature and it becomes more or less magnetic if it's under certain circumstances. What happens in this model of Bali is it stops. When they get to the large scale thing in which no one can do any better, it freezes. simulation, in other words, the simulation ends. So maybe that's the attractor. Okay, so that's a little story about a very simple lattice model. Here's really Bali. Here are coded photographs from Google Earth, straight out of Google Earth, showing the different colors indicate the irrigation stage of those paddies. You're looking down on a pretty large area of Bali, looking at different farms, and you'll notice that they are colored differently because they're planting at different times. There are some very large patches, the blue one, just a few of those, and there are lots of little ones and a kind of medium number of medium ones. So that's a power law. It's a very regular relationship that we see in the frequency distribution of those patches, which would be consistent with the model I just showed you. Here are the correlation distances, which is just how correlated is one part of it to the next, to the next. The next falls off in a linear way. Okay, so it's orderly. Something orderly has happened. Here's another randomly chosen part of Bali, chosen because there was no cloud cover that day, so we could take the picture, do the calculations, same thing. So we did this 13 times, and it worked every time, at which point we said, we're not going to press our luck now. We're going to publish the paper, which says that this very simple model shows that the rice terraces of Bali, the mosaic of cropping patterns, has self-organized to the critical point. It's a process of adaptive self-organization, which takes it to a place where, in the model, everybody does very well, and maybe in the real world, they're also doing very well because they've been at this for 1,000 years, and they're probably pretty good at it by now. So the point is, here is a very simple model to explain the distribution of patches moving to a transition, a critical point. The only difference between this and a normal async model in physics is this process is adaptive. In physics, you have to change, so there has to be an external control parameter that changes, like the temperature, and then that will govern the dynamics of the model. Here, the farmers in the model, the little dots, they just adapt to each other, and that drives the system to that point. And here's the punchline. Here we have the trade-off between pest stress and water stress, which determines the dynamics. All of the real data falls in that little window, which is where the phase transition happens. So I'm not sure how much, anyway, that's the story. And what I take from it to be most interesting is that it's very simple. I've just got email this morning from Marianne Dumas at Santa Fe, who wants to try to get her graduate students at London School of Economics to try to duplicate the same thing, which means take images from Google Earth of anthropogenic landscapes, landscapes that people have interacted with, and calculate the correlation distances between the patches to see what kind of organizational structure has occurred. Is it random? Is it centrally planned? Or is it the result of an adaptive process? In much of the tropics, my claim will be, an adaptive process has been going on, but if you were an economist, Carlo, if you were an economist and looked at that mosaic, you wouldn't see that as a well-organized system, right? We just don't have a model for that. Those patches of rice terraces in Bali look chaotic. Actually, they're not. So we need to kind of widen our vocabulary of models so we can see these things. And this is my last slide, right? These are scale effects. The infrastructure development plans in the tropics, by and large, they're not looking at these simple models out of complexity. And that can lead us into real problems very quickly. In Bali, not understanding this system almost meant the end of the Subak system in Bali in the 1970s with the Green Revolution, and so forth. So I think my points are two. First, we need to pay attention to what's going on in the tropics. And secondly, we should be looking for the results of the kinds of processes that Maya was talking about, to see if they're there before we turn the thing over to the central planners. All right, thank you very much.